One winter morning, Evan Carter jolted awake, his breath already fogging in the freezing air. He glanced at the thermometer on his porch, minus 48 degrees Celsius, the coldest he had ever witnessed in his life. Even as a lifelong Montanan used to brutal winters, this was something else entirely. The world outside his window was frozen solid. Every branch, every blade of grass was encased in ice, shimmering like glass under the pale gray sky. The air was deadly still, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was eerie, almost haunted. And then the wind began. It howled through the trees, with a high-pitched, ghost-like wail, whipping the snow into twisting white columns that spun and danced like spirits set loose from another world. Evan stood by the frosted window, coffee mug in hand, mesmerized by the surreal spectacle. The storm didn't just chill the bones, it felt like it had frozen time itself. Something about that morning felt different, charged like the calm before a miracle or a disaster. He didn't know it yet, but what waited beyond that veil of snow would change his life forever. Evan took a slow sip from his coffee, his eyes still fixed on the storm outside. The snow swirled violently, but something in its rhythm shifted. A flicker of movement, different, deliberate, caught his attention near the edge of the porch. He leaned in closer, squinting through the frost-caked glass. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Just beneath the window, crouched low against the house, was a bobcat. Her golden-brown fur, now laced with ice, trembled with every gust of wind. Her sides heaved with shallow breaths, each exhale forming small puffs of fog against the bitter air. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, 3 tiny cubs huddled in a fragile mound of snow-covered fur. They were barely distinguishable from the white landscape, only their faint, desperate movement gave them away. One of them, smaller than the others, lay sprawled in the snow, its frail body twitching weakly as if on the verge of surrender. Evan's fingers tightened around his mug, the ceramic suddenly feeling heavier. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen bobcats in the wild before, always from a distance, always majestic and untouchable, but never like this, never so close, never so vulnerable. Then it happened. The mother bobcat, with deliberate care, picked up the smallest cub by the scruff of its neck. Her movements were fluid, purposeful, but gentle, every step revealing a mother's quiet desperation. She crept forward closer to the house, and then did something that made Evan's knees weaken. She pressed the tiny, lifeless body of her cub against the window glass. Her breath fogged the pain as she looked inside, straight at Evan. And in that moment, the wildness fell away. Her eyes, deep amber and filled with a quiet storm of emotions, locked onto his. They weren't the eyes of a beast. They were the eyes of a mother, of a soul silently pleading for help. There was no growl, no snarl, no sign of aggression. Just raw, unfiltered desperation and hope. Evan stood frozen. He could hear nothing but the roar of the wind and the thunder of his own heartbeat. The cup slipped from his fingers and shattered on the wooden floor, coffee spilling across the rug in a steaming puddle. He didn't even flinch. Outside, the bobcat didn't move. Her cub still pressed against the glass, still trembling faintly. And then she did something that defied everything Evan thought he knew about wild animals. She raised a paw and tapped the window, not once, but rhythmically. Her claws clicked softly like a code, like she was knocking, asking to be let in. Evan's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. Wild animals didn't behave like this. They didn't look you in the eye and ask for help. They didn't bring their dying young to your doorstep and hope for mercy. And yet, here she was. He felt torn between instinct and empathy. Everything he'd learned told him not to interfere with wildlife. It was dangerous, irresponsible, unpredictable. But looking into those eyes, seeing that cub barely clinging to life, he knew he couldn't just stand there. A battle waged inside him. Logic screamed, "Don't do it!" But something deeper, something primal whispered, "You have to." He stepped back from the window, pulse pounding. His feet moved almost of their own accord. Every step toward the door felt like crossing some invisible line between man and nature safety and risk the known and the unthinkable. As he reached for the doorknob, a gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows violently. But Evan didn't stop. Slowly, cautiously, he cracked the door open just a few inches. The cold slammed into him like a wall, and then the Bobcat moved. With the grace of a dancer and the care of a mother, she padded forward and gently laid the smallest cub on the threshold. Then she stepped back, never taking her eyes off Evan. Her posture low, non-threatening. Her gaze still pleading. Evan knelt. The cub was barely warm. Its tiny sides rose and fell with ragged effort like a candle's flame flickering in a storm. He didn't hesitate anymore. He scooped the cub into his arms, cradling its limp body against his chest. The coldness of its fur was alarming, a heartbeat away from death. As he backed into the house, the mother remained where she was, snow swirling around her like a cloak. And then she did something Evan didn't expect. She looked toward her remaining cubs, and then back at him. The message was clear: please, the others too. Evan stood heart-racing and opened the door wider. The door creaked open wider, letting in a gust of wind so cold it felt like it could shatter bone. Snow blew into the entryway, swirling at Evan's feet, but he didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the mother Bobcat still poised just outside her amber gaze, never wavering. She didn't move at first. Her breath came out in slow, controlled puffs, as if even breathing had to be calculated in such brutal cold. Then, with the same purposeful grace she'd shown before she turned back to the small mound of fur behind her, the two remaining cubs shivering violently in the snow. She nudged the first cub gently with her nose, urging it forward. The tiny creature stumbled its paws, sinking into the powdery snow, but it obeyed. Step by step, it made its way toward the open door. Evan held his breath. It stopped just at the edge of the threshold, confused and scared. The mother stepped up behind it and gave one final nudge, sending it across the line between wilderness and warmth. Evan bent down and scooped the cub into his arms just like the first. It was slightly stronger, but still desperately cold. He wrapped it in his sweater and stepped back to let the mother retrieve the last one. Again she moved with care, this time slower, as if knowing it would be the last. The final cub was curled tightly, its paws drawn close to its body. A soft mule barely escaped its throat. The mother licked its face once, then picked it up with her teeth and carried it carefully to the doorstep. But she didn't immediately retreat this time. Instead, after placing the cub down, she stood at the threshold herself, body half turned toward the door, half toward the white wilderness behind her. She hesitated. Evan knelt again, lifting the third cub into his arms, and then looked up at her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The open door stood between them like a symbol of trust, of surrender, of something no human handbook could ever prepare you for. Evan saw it in her posture, in the subtle tension in her muscles. She was waiting for permission, not barging in, not asserting dominance, waiting. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply stepped aside, holding the door open with one hand, and gave her a single slow nod. And that was enough. The mother Bobcat stepped forward cautiously, but without fear. As she crossed into the house, she paused to shake the snow from her fur, sending a mist of ice crystals into the air. Then she padded softly onto the wooden floor, her paws silent her presence, almost reverent. Evan closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The house fell quiet, save for the soft breaths of the cubs and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure of what to do next. He had just let a wild predator into his home. Not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. He looked around his living room, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. This was no longer just a cabin in the woods. It had become something more, a sanctuary forged not by intention, but by instinct and compassion. The mother Bobcat walked carefully past him, her movements low and deliberate. She didn't explore. She didn't act curious or nervous. She went straight to her cubs, who now lay bundled in makeshift blankets near the fire. She nudged each one gently, checking their condition, licking their fur to warm them, her maternal instincts guiding every motion. Evan watched, transfixed. He had never seen anything so wild, yet so delicate. He felt like a witness to something ancient and sacred, a ritual of survival, a mother's fierce love playing out right there in his living room. And slowly, something inside him shifted. All his fears of danger, of doing something wrong, of crossing a line, faded, replaced by a kind of awe he couldn't quite explain. This wasn't about taming the wild or rescuing animals for glory. It was about connection, about recognizing the moment when nature lays down its defenses and reaches out. He moved to the fireplace, gathering extra blankets and layering them near the warmth. He folded them into a thick, soft bed. The mother bobcat watched him closely but didn't interfere. When he finished, she gently picked up one cub at a time, placing them in the nest he'd made. She adjusted the fabric with her paws and nose, tucking her young in with surprising finesse. Then she curled her own body around them, shielding them from the cold that had nearly claimed their lives. Evan sat on the edge of a chair, the firelight flickering across his face. The room glowed in shades of orange and gold, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, the wind howled against the windows like a creature banished from this fragile haven of warmth and trust. He knew there would be consequences, questions, maybe even fear from others if they ever found out. But at that moment, none of it mattered. He had opened a door, and something wild had walked through, not to harm, but to ask for help. And Evan Carter had said yes. The storm outside showed no signs of slowing. Snow lashed against the windows with furious intensity, but inside Evan's cabin, a strange peace had settled. The crackling fire cast a soft amber glow across the room, warming the air and softening the edges of reality. The once cold and lifeless space now felt alive with breath, with warmth, with something almost sacred. The bobcat mother lay curled around her cubs, nestled in the makeshift bed Evan had prepared near the fireplace. She kept one eye half open, always alert, yet somehow calm. Her body rose and fell in slow, steady rhythm, each movement deliberate. She didn't prowl or hide or hiss. She didn't scratch at furniture or explore aimlessly. She simply stayed close to her young, moving, only to adjust the blankets with her paws or reposition a shivering cub closer to the fire. She behaved not like a wild predator, but like a guest who knew she didn't belong here and was grateful for the sanctuary nonetheless. Evan sat a few feet away on a worn armchair, a fresh mug of coffee in hand, still trying to process what was happening. Every so often his eyes met hers, and each time something passed between them. A silent understanding. A shared awareness that transcended logic. Her gaze wasn't feral. It was steady, intelligent, and calm, filled with a quiet kind of gratitude. She didn't cower. She didn't assert dominance. She simply existed in the space he had opened for her, acknowledging his presence with trust, so rare it almost felt fragile. And then came the moment that truly shifted everything. She stood, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with intention. She walked slowly toward the edge of the kitchen, her paws silent on the wooden floor. Then she stopped, turning her head to look back at Evan. Her body language wasn't demanding, but inquisitive, expectant, as if she was trying to ask a question without words. Evan hesitated, watching her, and then it hit him. She was hungry, not for herself, for her cubs. He got up slowly, careful not to startle her, and moved to the fridge. She didn't move, just stood still and watched. He pulled out some leftover cooked chicken, shredded it into small pieces, and placed them on a ceramic plate. Then, setting the plate on the floor halfway between them, he stepped back. She waited. Only when he sat down again did she approach. Each step was slow, deliberate. She paused to sniff the air, then reached the plate and took a small piece in her mouth. But instead of eating it, she carried it back to her cubs. One by one, she fed them, placing the pieces gently in front of their tiny mouths. She waited patiently as they ate her tail, flicking softly behind her. Evan felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but awe. She was cautious, yes, but also trusting. It was a trust earned not through force, but through quiet compassion. The cubs, for their part, remained unusually calm. They didn't scurry or scratch. They didn't hiss or hide. They nestled together occasionally, lifting their small heads to peer around the room, their wide eyes resting on Evan. And there was no fear in those eyes, only curiosity, safety. It was as if they knew they were being helped. As hours passed, the mother bobcat resumed her place beside them. She licked their faces with rhythmic tenderness, her rough tongue coaxing life back into their fur. Evan couldn't look away. The firelight flickered across the scene, casting golden shadows that danced along her sleek body, catching in the glint of her watchful eyes. At one point, one of the cubs tried to stand. Its legs wobbled, and it stumbled forward into its mother's chest. She caught it, instinctively nudging it back into place with her nose and curling her tail around it like a blanket. A tiny mew escaped the smallest one, its first true sound since entering the cabin, and Evan felt a lump rise in his throat. He realized something profound in that moment. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about communication, about coexistence, about recognizing that empathy and love weren't traits limited to humans. The bobcat mother didn't need words. She didn't need to purr or growl or cry out. Everything she needed to say, she said with her body, with the way she looked at him, the way she waited for permission, the way she fed her young before herself. It was a conversation built on trust, not speech. And Evan answered it not with commands or expectations, but with space, with warmth, with silence. As the hours stretched on and the storm outside roared into the evening, a new kind of storm had settled inside the cabin, a quiet storm of transformation. Evan felt something stirring in his chest that had long been dormant: connection. To nature, to life, to something bigger than himself. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the small family curled beside the fire. He still didn't fully understand what had brought them to his door or why they had chosen to trust him. But he knew deep in his bones that this was no accident. This was grace, wild and wordless. Evening crept in slowly, as if the storm outside had swallowed the sun. The light through the windows faded from gray to near black, until all that remained was the constant white hiss of snow plastered thick against the glass, and the mournful wail of the wind. It wasn't just a passing flurry anymore, it was a siege. Evan stood by the front door, staring out through a narrow slit in the frost-covered pane. He could barely see more than a few feet beyond the porch. Snow had piled halfway up the window frames, and the air was so dense with ice particles that it looked like the entire world had dissolved into mist. He pressed a hand against the cold glass. It was like touching death. Behind him, the fire crackled and popped, sending waves of warmth into the room. The bobcat mother lay curled around her cubs, all of them now dry, and breathing more easily, their tiny bodies rising and falling with rhythmic peace. It should have been a comforting sight. But instead, Evan felt a weight growing in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't yet dared to name. The adrenaline of the moment had faded. The awe, the wonder, the surreal beauty of the connection. It was still there. But now it was joined by something heavier: responsibility. He paced slowly across the room, rubbing the back of his neck. His mind, once quiet, now buzzed with questions. How long would the storm last? What if the cubs weren't strong enough to leave tomorrow? What if the mother turned on him? What if someone found out he wasn't a vet? He wasn't a wildlife expert. He was just a man with a warm cabin and a heart that had said yes when no one else could. And now that yes had consequences. His instincts warred with each other. On one hand, every fiber of his upbringing screamed at him, Wild animals don't belong in your home. You can't domesticate nature. Don't interfere. On the other hand, how could he send them back out there, into that icy oblivion, into a night that even he, with walls and fire, could barely withstand? The thought of opening the door and watching those small bodies disappear into the snow made his stomach turn. But the longer they stayed, the more complicated things became. What if one of the cubs got sick? What if the mother became aggressive? What if someone saw tracks and reported it? What were the legal implications of harboring wild animals? Even for a night, Evan sat down heavily on the armchair, elbows on knees, head in his hands. The firelight danced along the wooden floor, casting flickering shadows across the bobcat's fur. She looked up, sensing his shift in energy. Their eyes met again, but this time something in his gaze had changed. She didn't react with fear or withdrawal. She simply watched him, alert but calm, as if she understood the storm within him now matched the one outside. And somehow, that made it worse. He whispered into the room, "What am I supposed to do?" No answer came, just the muffled roar of wind pressing against the house like a living thing, like some hungry beast clawing at the walls. The snow thudded heavily on the roof in great avalanches, making the lights flicker for a moment. The whole cabin felt like it was shrinking, less a home now, and more a fragile pocket of warmth, floating in a sea of cold and uncertainty. The cubs stirred slightly, their paws twitching as they dreamed. One gave a soft whimper, and the mother bobcat immediately shifted, licking its face and curling closer. Her instincts were flawless, pure, automatic, unrelenting. Evan stared at her, realizing something both terrifying and humbling. She wasn't second-guessing. She wasn't pacing or doubting or wrestling with fear. She was just being what she needed to be. A mother. That clarity gutted him, because he wasn't sure if he could say the same about himself. He wasn't sure if he was strong enough to be what this moment required, not just kind, but committed. Shelter wasn't just warmth and space, it was responsibility. It meant staying even when it got hard, especially then. He rose again and walked to the kitchen, grabbing more chicken this time, adding some rice and broth. He carefully placed the plate on the floor and stepped back. The mother approached, slowly sniffed it, then looked up at him. That same look, still trusting, still waiting. And something cracked inside him. It was no longer about helping a family of animals survive the night. It was about being worthy of the trust he had been given. He nodded softly, almost to himself. "You're not going back out there. Not yet. Not until you're ready." The wind howled in agreement or protest outside, but inside the fire roared louder. Evan pulled a blanket from the couch and laid it gently over the armchair, then grabbed another for the floor beside the hearth. He wasn't sure how many nights they'd be there. He wasn't sure what the next day would bring. But he knew one thing for certain: he had opened his door. And now, he would not close it too soon. The storm broke without warning. After days of endless white, the wind softened to a whisper, and the clouds parted just enough to let faint golden morning light seep through the frost-covered windows. The world outside Evan's cabin, once an impenetrable blizzard, now lay blanketed in stillness, a vast expanse of glistening snow, untouched and utterly silent. Inside, the air was warmer, softer. The fire, now reduced to glowing embers, cast long shadows that moved slowly across the walls. It had been nearly 2 days since Evan first opened his door to the wild. 2 days of quiet breathing, of careful feeding, of wordless coexistence. And now, the moment he had both anticipated and dreaded had come. The mother bobcat stood near the window, her breath fogging the glass. She was calm but alert, her body stretched tall, her movements fluid like a creature born of snow and light. Her cubs, stronger now, steadier on their paws, gathered around her, brushing against her legs, their tiny forms no longer trembling. Evan watched from the kitchen, a bowl of warm water still in his hand. Something about the morning felt different. Final. The mother looked over her shoulder at him. There was no urgency in her gaze, no panic, just clarity, a quiet message in her posture. It's time. She stepped toward the door, pausing as if waiting for Evan to understand. He did. Wordlessly, he walked across the room and opened it. A sharp breath of cold air rushed in, biting and clean, filled with the scent of pine and new snow. The light outside was soft, almost dreamlike, the forest beyond bathed in hues of blue and silver. The bobcat took a step forward, then paused at the threshold. Her cubs clustered behind her, hesitant but trusting. Then she turned. For a breathless second, she looked up at Evan and lifted her front paw. She placed it gently on his arm. The contact was light fleeting, just the pad of her paw resting against his sleeve, warm and real and impossible. It wasn't forceful, it wasn't dramatic, but it was everything, a gesture so simple yet filled with meaning, not instinct, not coincidence, recognition, gratitude, a farewell. Evan didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there staring down at the paw resting against him and felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. And then she was gone. She stepped into the snow, her body gliding silently, the cubs following close behind. One by one they vanished into the white, their tracks the only proof they'd ever been there at all. The last cub paused, looking back just once, then scampered after its siblings. Evan stood in the doorway, long after they'd disappeared into the trees. The snow was falling again, light now, peaceful, dusting the trail the bobcat family had left behind. Within minutes, the prints began to fade, swallowed by the wilderness, as if nature herself wished to keep their visit a secret. But Evan didn't need proof. He would never forget. He leaned against the doorframe, the cold biting his cheeks, his breath clouding the air. And still, he didn't move, because a part of him was still with them, still in that paw on his arm, in those silent glances, in the unspoken promise exchanged between two species who had shared a moment beyond understanding. The cabin behind him felt suddenly too quiet, too empty. He turned back inside, slowly closing the door. The space they had filled beside the fire on the old blankets felt sacred now, like an altar left behind after a miracle. He didn't have the heart to clean it up just yet. Instead, he knelt beside the fireplace and ran his fingers across the folds of the blanket now flattened by tiny bodies that had once shivered there. A faint mew echoed in his mind, the sound of life returning from the edge. He smiled. Not a big smile, a quiet one. The kind that belongs to people who've witnessed something rare, something no one would ever believe unless they saw it for themselves. He knew he couldn't explain it. Not fully, not to anyone. It wasn't just a rescue story. It wasn't just a snowstorm or a wild animal entering a house. It was a connection, pure, primal, and profound. The bobcat family had entered his home from the edge of death, and somehow in that exchange they had given him something too. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, hands steady now, and sat in the same chair where he had first watched the storm. But this time, there was no fear, no uncertainty, just stillness, just memory. Out there in the endless white life had moved on, but inside something eternal had been left behind. Weeks passed, but the memory never did. Evan still walked past the blankets by the fireplace, still half expecting to see a flick of golden fur, a pair of amber eyes watching him in silence. But the cabin was quiet now, peaceful in a different way. Not empty, just changed. Something inside him had shifted forever. He had always admired nature from afar, a respectful observer of the wild world beyond his doorstep. But that winter morning, nature stepped forward. Not to be studied, but to be trusted. And in choosing him and asking for help without words, the mother bobcat had extended a kind of invitation to feel, to understand, to share the burden of survival. It was never just about saving lives. It was about what it means to be human, to respond to vulnerability with compassion, to see fear in another's eyes and offer warmth, to realize that intelligence and emotion aren't bound by species, they're universal threads that connect all living things. That paw on his arm wasn't just a thank you, it was a message. We are not so different. And Evan knew without question that this was the most extraordinary moment of his life, a miracle wrapped in snow and silence, a reminder that even in the coldest places, love still finds a way in.